Good morning, Bruins. Nothing like starting the day, at least we're starting the day in Westwood with the stylings of the UCLA band, right? And for those of you who have been away for a bit, we've started basketball season. We're in the midst of a successful knock-on football season. So there's a lot of energy and we're back. Campus has returned. Our students are back on campus and Bruin Walk is full and hopefully all those memories are flooding back to you right now. Excuse me, let me introduce myself. For those of you I've not met out there, my name is Julie Sina, and I have hopefully what you're sensing, the joy of serving as your UCLA Alumni Director. And one of the things that we've done over the last 2 years is to have conversations with our alumni all around the world, just checking in and talking about what has life been like while the world has shut down, right? While the world has shut down and there's so many different things that we're dealing with across multiple areas. And so we've had these great conversations, a day in the life. And so this week, while it's International Education Week at UCLA, we thought let's do a check-in. And so we've got 4 fabulous alumni, no pressure, everybody, that we're going to do just that this morning. We're going to check in and see how folks are doing, what's going on in their worlds, and basically how we're showing up after we've experienced something that none of us could have ever anticipated as we were putting together those life plans when we were UCLA students, right? So we're going to have a conversation. We welcome your questions, so feel free to put those in the chat and we'll try to get through everything we can today. We're also recording this session, and so please let your friends know that may not have been able to join, that they can catch up on the conversation. We'll also get to any questions that we don't get to as a follow-up to that. So with that, let me also share with you, for those of you that may not have access to the screen, if I've not met you yet, I have dark hair. I'm wearing glasses that have a little bit of green on top, dark on the bottom, and a dark sweater and a blue blouse underneath. So really, really glad that you could be with us this morning. So let me stop that babbling and jump right in. And if we could, colleagues, let's just start with those demographic questions. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself, say where you're at now. Maybe I know a couple of you have moved around during the pandemic, so where you've lived over the last couple of years, 2 years. So name, where you are now, where you may have moved around during the pandemic, and if you're willing to share, perhaps the year that you graduated and what you majored in at UCLA. I know that's a lot, so we can kind of remind each other. So let's do the proverbial popcorn around Zoom. So I'm going to start with somebody, and then you can choose the person to follow. So except for popcorn also always makes me think of snacks. And I'm sorry we're not providing those this morning on our Zumba. So Victoria, if we could start with you.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning to those of you in California. Good evening to any of you who are joining from Europe or other similarly timed places. My name is Victoria Frost. I graduated in 2007 with a bachelor's degree in American Literature and Culture. And I'm currently based in London, and I have been for the duration of the pandemic. And I work at a university, so it's particularly appropriate during International Education Week to think about what it's been like. Lovely to hear and picture UCLA being back in full swing. And it's nice, that's similar to what I'm experiencing now. I think I hit all the demographic questions.
You did perfectly, perfect. Victoria.
Then I'm gonna pass over to Matt next.
Hey, Victoria, thanks. My name is Matt Muldavin. I graduated in 2018. I double majored in economics and Spanish. I'm living in Mexico City today. I've been here for about 1.5 years. And I started the pandemic in San Francisco, bounced around to LA, and then I moved here to Mexico City in June of last year. So about 1.5 years. Anything I'm missing there? I don't think so.
So what do you do in Mexico City, Matt?
Oh yeah, I work at a venture capital firm here called Magma Partners, and I'm the head of human capital. So that's my role here.
Thank you.
Awesome. Pietro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pietro Mendes. I'm going to try to hit all the questions, but I'm sure not going to remember one of them.
That's okay. That's what we're here for.
So I graduated actually in 2021, but I am from the 2022 class. I graduated 6 months early. And also, like Matt, during the pandemic, I kind of moved around a lot. I started the pandemic, well, in LA when I was still at UCLA, then moved to Brazil, stayed a good year there, then graduated from UCLA, and now I'm living in New York and I work at Citibank.
So Pietro, you graduated from UCLA while you were studying in Brazil. Is that?
No, it's almost that. I actually went back to UCLA for 2021.
Got it.
So from January till December, I was there, and then I moved to New York. So
Got
the
it.
period I was in Brazil was the beginning of the pandemic, so March 2020 to the end of 2020.
You know, I remember talking to you on one of those chats that I mentioned, and I don't know about everybody else, but for me, I'm still living in that proverbial Blur's day. That could have been yesterday, it could be tomorrow. So, John, I think you are saving you for the last one.
Great. Thanks, Julie, and thank you for inviting me in to be here. John Arboleda, class of 96. I was a transfer student that majored in Latin American studies. I've been living in Europe the last 18 years, and the last 12 years have been in Barcelona, Spain. And during the pandemic, the only move we did was we changed home locations within the city. That was our big change that we did. That was a big thing as well for lots of people to do that. And I lead a coaching-based leadership development business that I run here globally from here to do.
Thank you so much, John. So jumping right in, I know one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is just how we're showing up. Now we've kind of hoping we're on the other side of many things, right? So I'm wondering if we could start with, if you'd be willing to share, how has the pandemic shifted your mindset, if you will, about work-life balance? Anybody want to jump in on that one? You're not going to start with an easy question with this group because you're Bruins. I know you can jump right in. So anybody willing to jump on that, John?
I'll be happy to jump into that. It's a great question. I think the way that what I've seen, and I'm saying from my personal experience and even a bit of the professional experience, I think the last 2 years we were reacting and trying to survive with everything that was going on, work, at school, with children, or if you're at university, and trying to survive to everything that was going on that we weren't ready for to be able to do that. And I think it's got a lot of people thinking about their own realities and their current situations. And I think things were just bubbling up to some of the surface. 2 years later, what's happening is that now that things are somewhat settled, or there's somewhat stability at least, I think what's percolating is the individuals popping up and saying, what about me now? How have I changed? What does this mean for me now? Because who I was during those 2 years have evolved either by by circumstance or by choice. And I think I've been seeing a lot of that from a personal point of view. Work-life balance. I was working at a large multinational company during that time, and I realized that that's not what I wanted to continue doing because it wasn't aligned with what I wanted to be doing.
So John, you made that transition during the pandemic. You switched jobs during the pandemic.
Definitely to switch jobs from a large multinational company to launching my own business and really doing a career transition that was really aligned with me. And I think what became important for me was, I say, purpose, and you found purpose, people and place, which has a certain meaning for me. And I was aligning those. And that was the big change for me, was to align with that. And I have to say, at the end of the day, I have 2 children and I'm married, to being more present with my family, because I really wasn't during those 2 years. And
so you just to follow up quick, and then we will move on here, is so am I hearing you right in that the pandemic influenced that decision you made to move from that large corporate life to your own business?
Yeah, it did. It brought things to the surface, and you had to confront. You put it under the rug, or you want to confront it. And I think that's what that happened with me, and I think it's happening with a lot of people we work with, and we're seeing to be able to do that. So I think the last 2 years is the individuals popping up about, what about me now?
I think the pandemic certainly gave us more time for reflection, right?
Yeah.
So anybody else want to take that one on, how the pandemic might have affected sort of your thinking around work-life balance?
Yeah, I can talk quickly. I think what you just said there, Julie, is spot on in my life, at least, with having time to reflect and kind of prioritizing the you, right? And not just the professional path you think you should go down. I moved here to Mexico City during the pandemic, which was something that was I wanted to do, but was unexpected. I was going to move to Colombia beforehand, and then it all changed during the pandemic. And it was all for the better. And I think I really got a lot of time to reflect on what I wanted to do. I ended up coming down here, and I just switched jobs about 4 months ago, actually. And it was all because I had more time to reflect, I think. And talking to my peers or just people really globally, I think it's a similar message, right? And they really got to understand what they want. And I think what John was saying, they're matching kind of their personal life with their professional life, and making sure that every aspect of their life is kind of headed the direction they want.
No, I appreciate that, Matt. And, Pietro, I'm just going to go to you, since you're sort of, early in your career journey, if I could say, do you think, how did the pandemic affect your thinking about that in any way, if it did, in terms of those decisions, that decision-making process for you?
I was about to mention how, for me, I kind of got both sides of it, like what is studying during the pandemic and what it's like to work during the pandemic, even though since I started work at the beginning of the year, it hasn't been really like the same pandemic that we were used to in 2020 and 2021. But I feel like it's very different, and I try to compare them, but I have trouble trying to find like a good way to compare them, because when I was taking classes at UCLA during the pandemic, it was all virtual. A bunch of classes were recorded, so I could watch them at my own pace. And I was also living in Brazil, so the time difference was also a factor there. But now doing work, I also am lucky to have the flexibility. So if I want to work from home 1 or 2 days, I can. But it's different because it's not like you can be, I don't know, waiting to watch class. You know what, I'm gonna cook now and I can watch this class in 20 minutes. It's a little bit different. But I do think that I'm trying to see the good side of it, right? I feel like this, especially like a big bank allowing you to work from home and giving you the flexibility to do it, that's really good. I feel like, and even if when I talk to the office of the people here, I feel like we're all pretty on the same page when it comes to that. If you want to take your kids to school and you might not have time to commute, like it makes sense for you to work from home, and having the option to do it is really nice.
So people you're sensing that people are giving more flexibility about how people are approaching their work. But I do resonate with something that you said. I mean, I think during the pandemic, we had the opportunity to do all kinds of things because we could also go off screen and showing up differently is also that sense of presence about that. But I do appreciate what you're suggesting, that I think that we're providing some more flexibility in terms of how we show up. So stepping back a minute to where you're all living, how is everything back up and running, or have you seen that transition complete? And I just to share with our audience, I told folks at the beginning, we're not going to ask you to speak for your whole country, but yeah, we kind of are. So what's it like? Is everybody back at this point? Victoria, I'm going to ask you to speak for everyone in London, if you could.
I absolutely cannot, but I will give it a go. So actually, we were just talking about this we had a meeting of other university heads of well-being service, and we're talking about it, and it is in many ways back to complete normal. So the differences are that some people are working in hybrid models, and I think in universities particularly, most everybody is working hybrid. So my team are coming in 3 days a week on average, and are able to work from home too, and that's kind of the norm for universities. I've got lots of friends in banking in London, and I think it's similar. Many of them are able to work from home some days, although they might be in the office slightly more. But when you're out and about, it feels very normal. People are greeting each other by hugging or shaking hands or kissing on the cheeks, which was kind of unheard
we all
of.
stopped that for a while, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to see that there are more people wearing masks on public transportation than there used to be pre-pandemic, but it is still a much smaller percentage of people that are doing that. We, similar to, I think, other countries, are running booster programs now for the vaccine. And I think that's helping to give people some confidence, but we're not talking about it as much. So for a really long period of time, daily on the BBC headline page would be the case counts for different parts of the UK.
So right about that.
And that was a massive thing. And you can absolutely still find that data, but you have to go searching for it. It's not as prominent. It's not as much a part of the daily discourse
Isn't
here.
that something, Victoria? I mean, you think about how that was really front and center, that count, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And COVID hasn't gone away, but we're still counting it. We're just not talking about that quite as much, which is good, I hope.
Yeah. So London is back, huh, Victoria?
Yes.
How about Mexico City?
Yeah, it's interesting. And Mexico City is, I think, the 5th biggest city in the world. There's 22 million people here. And it was a really slow off-ramp, I think. Just 3 weeks ago is when the mask policy was lifted. So that's walking
just
down the
3
street.
weeks ago.
Yeah, in October, beginning of October.
When was it listed in London? When was it lifted in London, Victoria?
Oh my gosh, this is pulling back last summer. Summer 21.
Yeah.
No, and I visited the US a couple times in between, and it was always a shock. But no, things have suddenly, started to get back to a little bit of normal. With such a big city, I think there's a lot of people you'll still say wearing masks and everything like that. The hybrid working model has completely changed, I think, for people working in big corporate jobs. Before, Mexico City was very traditional, definitely 5 days a week in the office, even with some startups, and that's completely changed. I'm a little biased because I work with startups who are almost entirely remote or have offices that are optional to go into. But one thing I've observed is that.
But do you feel like people are going, when you say optional, or a lot of what's sort of that sense of people going in or not?
Yeah, there's definitely been a surge in the last 6 months of people who want to go back into the office and work with teams. So there's been definitely a push back into the office for sure. The one thing that's really interesting is a lot of these companies within Spanish-speaking Latin America, the walls have really been torn down a bit. So I'm in Mexico City, but there's a lot of people working on teams in Colombia or in Chile or wherever throughout Latin America. And it's as if they're in the same country, and it's, there's no real issues in terms of team there. So if you think of kind of the US, how big it is and diverse, that's almost how Latin America has kind of become, at least in the Spanish speaking section, with a lot of these startups that are hiring people from all over the region.
One of the things, Matt, you're reminding me of, and we've certainly experienced this in the alumni space, is that I think one of the things that we've all benefited from, if I could say that, is that time zones and geography don't matter as much, because we can all come together in this way, right? Though we all have a visual of us all living in these boxes, but we can still all work with each other. Before we have you speak on behalf of all Spain, John, so just getting you ready there, Matt, I do want to mention that we just confirmed yesterday that UCLA, we were supposed to, just like we did in London. Last time I saw Victoria, we were in London for the centennial celebration, and we were scheduled to go to Mexico City to do that several years ago, and we canceled because the world shut down, right? So we're scheduled right now for March 22nd to be in Mexico City with the Chancellor to give you that celebration that we missed out on several years ago. So we'll keep you posted.
Amazing news.
Yeah. So John, let's talk to us about Spain.
The
all of Spain, John.
Of course, yeah. Living in Barcelona, speaking to Catalans, they may say that's all of Spain too.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a separate issue. No, but being more focused it's a lot of back to normal. I mean, I won't say there's back to normal. There's no back to normal. It's the next normal that people are living. What we're doing is we don't have these restrictions are up anymore. Public transportation, they say to wear a mask, but half the riders do not. Other than that, it's all, there's none of these restrictions. The things that do stand out, I live in a city has a high I live in Barcelona, high tourism. Tourism is back. What's interesting though, a couple of things that stand out is there's an issue with having workers who are working at restaurants and hospitality are not there. That's a big issue. Yeah. So the one thing is,
John, if I could hold your thought on that one, is that true also in London, Mexico, New York City? That because we're certainly seeing that here, John. The challenge in the workforce showing up, particularly in service industries. Is that the same? Getting some nods and some maybes.
It's absolutely the same. Yeah. The hospitality industry in particular is struggling for staff.
And I think the thing that it goes back to an early comment I said, people are now choosing themselves and what that means, and they're choosing something else. And so I think there's a lot of employers are struggling with what is back in Spain is a country that had where, like Matt was saying, you need to be sitting, in a more traditional type businesses or sectors. I need to see you at your desk. And people are saying, I don't choose that anymore. So employers and managers are struggling with that means. But one thing I want to call out that I've seen a lot in Spain, and I've seen the intensity of this rise, the number of US citizens that are relocating to Barcelona or Spain. Not even, they're choosing to live here. A number of people, I see it in a variety of places where I interact with. People are leaving the United States and are choosing to relocate here. Some of them for 6 months, some of them indefinitely, or it's a short-term period, and they're staying longer. Just in the next 3-4 months, I've got 4 friends, even of them, 2 UCLA alums that are relocating and moving here, and they're choosing to move that. I don't know how it is with the other countries, but we're seeing a big expats moving here. They're not company expats. I call them by choice, or the lifestyle.
Well, it's in some ways, John, it kind of mirrors the journey that you shared that you were on, in terms of making some real choices about, how you were going to show up every day, both professionally and personally.
Yeah.
So if I could just have a follow-up question for you too, John, because I know that you've got 2 school-aged children. So what was that experience? Are they fully back at school now? And were they learning from home for a while?
Yeah, similar to we actually changed schools with them during the pandemic as well. But when it hit us, we were like the majority of parents around the globe. The schools were unprepared. No one was really prepared what that meant, the schools, the teachers, to be able to do that. So they had that experience. And then when they went back to school during the pandemic, they were wearing masks, 7 hours a day. And that was a thing that they had to live and experience. And for the first 2 years of our new school, we weren't allowed on campus. We can only drop off and pick up our kids in the front of the school. So we couldn't interact or meet to be able to do that. This was the first academic year where we're able to be on campus, have face-to-face parent-teacher meetings, now have family events to being able to do that. So we're now able to re-engage with that. And I think the children have been great examples of the resiliency of how what they're capable of able to do that, and families as well. So yeah.
When you think about that, and I was reflecting on that when each of you were talking about your experiences, you think about kids growing up, and even our UCLA students. I was talking with a parent yesterday, who was talking about, she had been on campus during our recent family weekend. And for those of you that have been on campus during our family weekend, we go all out, right? And I said, are you okay? She goes, you know what? I realized I never experienced that because my students started school in that COVID year. So much of, when I started this call talking about sort of that atmosphere on campus, and I will apologize, you may hear some background noise. For those of you who may not know, the James West Alumni Center, where I am sitting, is next to the football practice field, and they're practicing. And let me just say, they play a lot of music of most people I don't recognize. I know the team's in trouble when Chip plays songs that I know. So they're practicing and the floor is vibrating. But those, I think there's also that sense when we talk about our own culture, wherever we are, how that was so different during the last couple of years, right? And so some of those shared experiences that we had as a community, you speak about the school experience, John, are those experiences that are new for many. So Pietro, you're speaking of being in large cities, you're in one of the largest cities of the world. How is everybody back? Are people masked? What's it like to walk the streets of New York City?
I feel like when I first got here at the beginning of the year, it was like the transition. So people were starting to come back to the city. And unfortunately, I had to look for an apartment during summer, which then I realized people were really coming back. But the way that I noticed, or the way that I kind of like measure how many people are back in the city, is by taking the subway, obviously, every morning. And in March, when I first started work, it was still pretty empty. But now I can tell that there's a lot more people. I can hardly ever find a seat in the subway. But yeah, I feel even going out during weekends and looking at the restaurants, you can notice the difference. There's a lot more people. And at least for New York, it feels a lot more like New York, right? Because what's New York without the people?
So Victoria, just to take it back to higher education for a minute, given that you work on campus, can you talk a little bit about what that was like there? And our students, you know, speaking of sort of those shared experiences, what's it been like for your students, and is everybody back to what it was like pre-pandemic?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, it's such a good opportunity for me to reflect, having done this conversation a year ago, and
Yeah.
I was trying to think about what was happening then and what was happening in the start of the pandemic. So I was in charge of all student COVID cases for the London School of Economics, where I work, and it was when I agreed to take that role, that was January 13th, 2020, and we were talking about 56 students whose home address was in Wuhan, China. So I was like, yeah, I volunteer. I can totally call them up and find out when the last time they were home was, no problem. And 18 months later, I sort of regretted volunteering for that role, but it was really interesting.
But what
were
an
one of the
important role
first
to volunteer for, Victoria. I'm sure you.
yeah, I mean,
students
I'm
were really
glad that I
grateful
did
for
it.
you.
It was
Yeah.
good to happen, but it was
I'm sure it was stressful for you.
It was stressful for me, and I've changed roles. So I still work at the London School of Economics, but I've changed roles within it. And part of that was similar to what John and Matt and Pietro were talking about, thinking about that work-life balance and where I want to be. But so we were one of the first London or UK universities to move fully online. And we made that decision for the rest of the academic year in early March. And then we're largely international. So we're 68% international students. So it was many students went home, many students were able to go home, but not everybody was. So we kept halls open. We had students still here. So it was figuring out how to support those. What does that look like? And then similar to, I guess, most other institutions, planning for what's to come and what the future looks like. And trying to imagine that the best we could. We, in the UK, we went through 3 periods of lockdown. So we had the first lockdown, which was from end of March until June. And then we had a November lockdown. That wasn't quite enough time. So then we went back into lockdown in January and came out of that in April 2021. So the November and January to April lockdowns were most of that next academic year. So students had come back. The kind of line was, we're open. It might be slightly, 2 meters distance, but please come to London. Please come to campus. We're going to be open. And then we weren't really. And so how do you deal with that? And what does your student experience look like? Similar to John's kids. And if you've, if you don't have welcome week, yes, exactly. Yeah. And what does that look like if you can't meet people in your course and you're not able to join clubs and societies and, you're sitting in your room. And for us, the UK had many changing regulations, but if you were coming from certain countries, you needed to isolate for 2 weeks. And then once you were here, if someone in your household developed COVID, then you had to isolate for a 2-week period. It at some point changed to 10 days, but we had a student who came from Taipei. She isolated for the 14 days for travel. She was like living in her student accommodation for a couple of days. Someone in her flat got COVID. She went into a 2-week isolation. They came out of that for 4 days and she went back into, someone else got it and they went, and she ended up isolating for essentially the first 6 weeks of term, couldn't leave her bedroom. And what does that do to a student experience and how, shifting to some things being online and trying to do socials, but as I'm sure everyone, the panelists and attendees, Zoom fatigue is real. And how much time, if you're spending time watching recordings of classes and lectures or going to office hours, do you also want to do yoga in your tiny little dorm room and then do a quiz later and come to a social and meet people that you don't really know and you can't really chat to in the same way. So it's nice now that it feels much more like our normal campus experience. I would say Campus Plus. So there are things that have worked really well. So I work in student well-being now. And one of the things that has been interesting for us is that we do counseling appointments and disability appointments. And the DNA rate did not attend. So the kind of no-show for our appointments is much lower for our online appointments than our in-person appointments. So how do we keep that and use that and make sure that we're still doing that so that we're not wasting time of counselors and we're getting as many students in the door as we can? And I think trying to pick up on those things.
Yeah, that, John, you kind of went there a little bit, is how do we, I think one of the conversations I think has been is that we think we've all, done a lot more thinking about how we engage in taking better care of ourselves, and how do we keep that trajectory going, right? So Victoria, if I could just ask a quick follow-up question for you is, just listening to you describe all of that, that's a lot. So, what's sort of your lesson learned coming out of that in terms of how you do that while also engaging in self-care for you to get through that?
Yeah, I think that is a tough thing. It was a really intense and stressful period from about March until January. I had something like 6 days off, including Christmas Day and a couple of random Sundays. But otherwise I had meetings or phone calls or whatever, because we were running our own testing facility, similar to many other universities. And so if a student tested positive, I would get a phone call at whatever time they tested positive, and we were running a 7-day-a-week testing facility. And it wasn't sustainable. And so I think we did do a debrief. One of the things that was good was that when I got to the point where I was like, oh, I'm not sure that I can do this, I asked for support, extra help, and I got it. So that was good. I possibly could have done that earlier. And I think that that's something for me to think about. And then just what I was reflecting on John's point around, like, what are my values? And I think it definitely used to be, I was an RA at UCLA. I got very involved in Dance Marathon, the Pediatric AIDS Coalition now, and a variety of other student orgs. And I love being busy, and I liked moving up within that and having leadership positions. And I still am driven and ambitious in that way, but I also don't need to do it quite as much, and to recognize so I'm trying to prioritize that. And for me, that means scheduling stuff in. So I play rugby a couple times a week, and that's helpful to get me out of the office and away from my desk and my screen.
Well, and just a little bit I know about rugby, it helps probably also do a little bit of venting out there in that field, right?
It does. I'm playing, we call it tag here. What would you call it in the States? Flag. So it's non-contact rugby, but it is really fun and social. And it's just, you can't think about whatever emails are in your inbox when you're either running with the ball or trying to stop someone else with it. Exactly.
Well, and I think what you've said, and each of you focus on a little bit is like, hopefully some of those things that we've all learned about slowing down a little bit. And I think the other piece that's important about that is that, as we also cited earlier, is that those of us who are in these management roles also to continue to give people space to do that, right? That's one of those universal COVID things. So I'm going to switch topics a little bit on you, or a big switcheroo is, again, this is where I'm going to ask you to maybe do some reflections on behalf of your whole countries or cities. Is talked about it being a rainy day in California yesterday. Well, yesterday was also a big day in that it was election day. Lots of things happened politically, over the last couple of years, right? But even with these midterms and elections here in the United States yesterday, just curious about sort of what's the play on the news right now in your respective areas about politics in America and the elections that we're dealing with, or your personal reflections, not on behalf of your whole country. So John, I'm gonna start with you. What is there? What's the news about American politics in Spain?
Because of the influence and the role of the U.S., these elections do get covered, and so that coverage comes up regarding what this means. One thing is, as people here trying to understand our legislative system and how that works, to be able to do that, especially because we're a two-party system. In Spain and across most of Europe, you can have parliamentary systems. So you've got coalitions that are coming and going all the time. Look at in the UK, the Prime Minister was there for 45 days. She's gone, someone else has come in. Very different. So one thing is for people to understand how that system works, but I think people are curious to see what that means. I think they're more curious now, looking ahead, what's going to happen in 2 years from now. and what the role is. They've seen the influence of how you can have whoever's going to be president, what impact and influence that can have across the country. And I think they're more aware of that because we've seen such a wide experience in that. I think there's some more curiosity regarding what's going on that in terms of the elections. I think they'll see what's going on, but then again, it's, okay, that's great, it's over there, but how's that going to impact us with what's going on or what's relevant to them? So I think that it's a wait and see at the moment and see what this new legislator is going to mean for the US or in the upcoming elections.
Mhm.
So I think it's more, they're observing closely and keeping an eye on what's going on.
Yeah, I'd
And-
say it's pretty similar in Mexico. I actually moved right during their midterms. They have presidential elections every 6 years here. And I moved last year, which is their midterms, which were huge here and a big deal when I first moved. I would say it's obviously there's a much closer relationship probably with Mexico and the US. However, in general, like in the news, the main focuses are in 2 years from now. The midterms aren't as top of priority, top of news here. One thing that is more direct and probably more integrated with my job as well is regarding kind of interest rates and those topics, which are super important and more immediately direct a lot of the kind of activity that a lot of businesses make down here. So that's kind of where I see it first and foremost.
Mhm.
I think in 2 years, there'll be a lot of coverage.
Oh,
Okay, gearing up
Julie,
for the
just-
John.
The one thing I would just add, I think even beyond that, it's the war in Ukraine. I think that's a really big issue that's coming up, and how that is reinforcing cross-Atlantic, transatlantic ties and relations beyond,
Mhm.
what's politics and what's going on. I think there's things about democracy and freedom and what that means and how we're uniting around that. I
Mhm.
think there's still a lot of that going on, and how to keep that top of mind. And you're right, what the elections mean, will that change? What could that influence? I think that's very much very present. Just wanted to add that component.
You know, that's
that
an
element.
excellent point, and it maybe brought some alignments, in that space of democracy that might not have been as strong before. Now, Victoria, I realize that your own politics in London may have taken the headlines, but is there, what's sort of the sense of where the US is at? We could probably talk
So-
about how we're all responding to London, but.
I mean, honestly, it's one of the first times where I've heard my British friends say, "Oh my gosh, our situation is way more screwed up than Americans," and I felt slightly. I mean,
There's a
not
compliment in there
relieved,
somewhere.
but yeah, there's a compliment in there. It's, as a dual citizen, I feel like I'm sad about both the state of both things. But yeah, I mean, I would say the U.S. election is fairly closely followed here. What I think is interesting, and what I think I've heard pundits and friends and also my friends who work in the civil service here talk about, is looking at this election as a possible indicator of what might happen if the UK were to call a general election. So
That's interesting.
inflation, as Matt said, is affecting everyone across the world. But it definitely, how to frame that as a global issue versus an individual country's issue is interesting. And I think from my impression, the state struggled with that people were blaming Biden for inflation when it is a global issue. And that's absolutely, I think, the case here, that people are blaming. And I will say that some of the Conservative Party's recent decisions have definitely exacerbated our financial issues. But the basis of that is that there are global issues around that. And I think that people are looking to the U.S. election and talking about it, and what would the similar thing happen, and how would you frame that, and what would that look like? But it is interesting for us because we don't have midterms, and we have general elections as often as the majority party wants to call for it, but at a maximum every 5 years. So we're not due one for a while, and it'll be interesting if the Conservative Party does call one sooner, because they're not looking in good stand right now.
I think that could be a whole nother Zumba for us, is talking about how elections work around the world, right? So Pietro, I'm on the left coast, you're on the East Coast. What was election day like yesterday in New York City?
I could notice it by the office. Just you see less people. Again, going back to the flexibility thing, a lot of people working from home, so they could get their votes in early that day. But what I think it would be more interesting to me to talk about is the elections in Brazil that
Please
actually
do.
took place last month, right? Or 2 weeks ago now, because I'm half Brazilian, half Argentinian. I don't think I mentioned that. But it's also, it's funny to see the difference because my whole family still lives in Brazil, and funny to see their reaction and the reaction of the people abroad, right? You can tell that for those of you who are not really into Brazilian politics, Bolsonaro, who is the current president, just lost the elections to Lula, who is an ex-president who was the president for 8 years back in the early 2000s. And you could tell that the world kind of preferred Lula. They saw him with better eyes, but there was a lot of division in Brazil. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the view of the people who actually voted. It's just more of like the exterior, the external view.
And how's your family feeling about all of that?
I mean, there was a little bit of unrest at the beginning, but now thankfully everything's fine. It's just because Bolsonaro is not ultra right, but he's on the right, and he made some comments earlier before the election saying that he might not give we call it there's a band that you like formally have to pass the next president in Brazil, and he made some comments saying that he wouldn't do that. So that was a little bit of a big deal, but thankfully he never explicitly admitted defeat, but he said that he would follow the constitution. So that basically means that hopefully everything goes smooth in January.
That's as close as that's going to get, huh?
Mhm.
So, staying with you for a second and then moving around to the others, as we again are hopefully, I think Victoria, you called it out earlier, where we're saying we've moved on from COVID, even though the pandemic's still going on, right? As you reflect on the last couple of years, going back to your student days for a minute, if you were the professor, what grade would you give your country in how they handled the pandemic? So you said, Pietro, you're half Brazilian, half Argentinian. You can pick a country there or do both.
That's a tough question because I feel
You're
like
the
both
you get to be the
countries.
professor, though.
I feel like both countries handled it really differently. Brazil, at the beginning, there was a lot of lockdowns, but I felt like the politicians were really scared of what it would do to the economy. So we were really quick to open up. And Brazil is one of the countries that has most people who eventually passed away from the pandemic, right? So that came at a cost. I think if I were to give a grade, it wouldn't be that high because it's a country with a lot of people, yes, but at the same time, those are a lot of deaths. I do not have the number out of the top of my head, but I remember it was second to the US for a long time. Argentina, on the other hand, the lockdowns were pretty strict and police would patrol the streets, and my family in Argentina would call me and say, yeah, I haven't left the house in a month, which I think it's also, it's good when it comes to like health and making sure that everyone stays safe, but you also need a balance because those people who might have lost their jobs are not making any income, and the assistance that the government provided wasn't nearly enough for you to take care of your family for a full month, a full year. So it wouldn't also be that high, probably a little bit higher than Brazil's, but I don't feel like both countries did as well as they could have done. And to be fair, like I don't see one country that got an A+ during the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Or at least none comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a good statement, Professor. So switching over to you now, Matt, also acknowledging that you did some moving during the pandemic. So you can grade the various places you lived. Again, you're the professor, so you get to put that out there in terms of what grade might you give.
No, I think Mexico I have the best perception on. And it's interesting. I think it reflects a lot of Mexico and Latin America as well. There's a huge informal economy. So even shutting down, working from home and all that, there's still a lot that is moving, on the surface. So not, you go on the street and during the pandemic, you might not know, apart from masks and things like that, because that's how a lot of people have to make a living is, if you're selling something on the street or these different mercados or whatever it may be. So a lot of that had to keep moving just for these people because they didn't have a choice. I think in terms of kind of when the vaccine started to roll out, you really saw the income inequality because you saw a lot of the more wealthy Mexicans or people living here flying to the US, getting a shot and coming back, right? A lot of people from Mexico City going to Texas, for example, doing a day trip and coming back. So that was fairly common, and the rollouts here were much slower. And depending on where you're located, you would either get different types of vaccines that wouldn't let you travel to the US or wouldn't let you travel to Europe, for example. So those are really kind of luck of the draw for most people here. In terms of kind of like I mentioned, only 3 weeks ago is when masking stopped here in Mexico City. However, in Guadalajara, for example, where I spent a good amount of time as well, they removed masks a long time ago, pretty much on the US standard. So by different regions, it kind of rolled out differently. Another interesting thing to note is during the pandemic and kind of moving in the last year and a half or so, there's been a crazy influx of digital nomads from the US that are now working from and living from Mexico City. Basically, you can spend 6 months here, go back to the US for 1 day and come back. And that's perfectly legal. And so there's a lot of people living that are Americans working remotely, living in Mexico City today. And there's a lot of negative effects on the local population, kind of gentrification with Airbnbs that is happening today as a result of the pandemic and kind of what the remote world has
Matt,
produced.
I think as I'm listening to you, you bring up some really, really great and sobering points really around the sense of access and privilege during the last couple of years as well, right?
Yeah, no, and it's really there's a couple of the areas here in Mexico City that are really popular, and you go around and you hear a lot of English today, and there's visitors, which is great, tourism's fantastic, but there's a lot of people who kind of feel entitled sometimes in these different areas. They mention how cheap everything is, not realizing or fully realizing they're making US dollars, and there's a lot of locals who are not making anywhere near kind of the equivalent. And so they're pushed out of these areas. There's more Airbnbs, kind of less of a neighborhood feel with a lot of these areas. So one of the negative kind of externalities to put on my economics hat.
And just curious also, Matt, in terms of you being there, working full time, is that something you find that you need to work through in terms of the perception of who you are and how you show up as somebody who's actually here or there?
Completely. No, and I'm from California. I speak perfectly fluent Spanish because I studied Spanish and I spent a lot of time, but it's something I try to, you can only do so much, but really be a part of the community as much as possible. It's a really cosmopolitan city, but the Americans that come here are usually the most kind of privileged, have the most money, and are most easy to kind of come off as Americans who are loud and have a lot of money. So trying to kind of beat that stigma down and just really contribute to the community as you can has been a big part of my time here.
Thank you. I appreciate the way you're showing up there, Matt. So John, how would you grade Spain?
First of all, I admire the leaders who had to confront this in Spain, and I think in other countries, knowing how to be prepared to manage this was in of itself, just showing up and not backing away from this, I think was given definitely a strong grade for that effort. I think once they had it down, once they kind of figured out what this was, because it's hard when I look back, there's blurs for me, to be honest, regarding this, kids and spouse, me not showing up, me being not fully present, all this stuff that's going on, it's big of a blur. But what comes to my mind is when we started getting the vaccines, how well they were organizing this, by the age groups, who was going, when you can go, when we would go get the vaccines. It was really well organized and being able to do this. We have these certain passes that you had to use, or sometimes when you're traveling in other countries across Europe. That was really, really efficient and well done. So I think they had great intentions, trying to figure it out, balancing economic, social, political impact, what's going on, who's doing what. I was always had a lot of empathy for the leaders who were trying to figure that out. And everyone was, being quarterbacking from the bench regarding what that should be like. So I think at the end, I think they did quite a good job, especially once things were moving forward and how we were getting vaccinated, how we were taken care of, and finding some additional support in the best way they could for people who were really being impacted. And how do you just stay afloat, and be in survival mode and not being tossed around to be able to do that. So
thank you, John.
And I think in the end, we see a little bit, we've had the same
Yeah, it's interesting just to hear the differences around, your comments, reflecting back on Pietro's comments on what his countries are experiencing. So Victoria, grade the United Kingdom for us.
Oof. I think we did some things well. Listening to the rest of the panel talk about things, it both kind of codified some of the thinking around vaccine rollout. I think we did really well. So I have a medical condition, so I was slightly up the list, but I got mine in January 2021, my first dose. And by the summer, everyone was eligible to get their first dose, and then they've done a good job of the follow-up stuff. So that's nice. It was equitable. Having a national health service, I think, was really interesting for us and helpful as a contrast to see that and to hear experiences in the States where people didn't have that. But, we didn't pay for testing. We didn't pay for vaccines. It wasn't about trying to get coverage from anything. It was just, you get a text, you can go and get your booster or your first jab or second, and it was done. And it was really easy and straightforward. And I think that was good. I think that absolutely, to John's point, I wouldn't want to be prime minister, be making these decisions, but retrospectively, the UK had a higher death rate than they should have compared to other similar countries, compared to the fact that we had vaccines, that we have a strong health service, and there's a problem there. And there's something that we need to pick up and look at, so that if it does happen again, we learn from it. And I think that hasn't happened yet, and that kind of is lowering my grade. At what point are we going to really reflect on it? I think people will say they acted with the information they had at the time, but I'm not 100% sure that's true. We were slightly slower to close down and then to reclose. I think we opened maybe around the same time, right time, and summer was a fine time to reopen because people were spending time outside, but case counts dramatically rose. We were really slow to put in another lockdown. There was a commitment that it would only be for November because Christmas was going to happen, and then Christmas was kind of canceled, which is the big thing here. We talk about Christmas being canceled for 2 years in a row. And I don't think that it needed to be. I think that, but it's easy for me to say that. I'm not trying to also balance the economics and the other aspects of it. I think I'd probably give a C-, maybe, if I had to give it a letter grade. And to the final point, I guess, is that it would have been nicer if our members of government had done a better job of following the rules that they were laying out and expecting others to follow.
Yeah. Totally. Really appreciate all of your reflections on that. So we're actually coming close to the end of our time. I told you this hour would go by fast. So I've got we'll see how many rapid fire questions I can get out here. So quick answer. What's your biggest takeaway from the last couple of years, pandemic wise? Matt.
Reassessing, each individual reassessing where they want to be, both personally and professionally, and how to make those meet.
Thanks. Pietro, biggest takeaway.
So one thing that I mentioned on our last call, actually, I don't know when it was, but it was last year, is every bad thing has also like something good about it. So for me, I felt like it was moving back with my parents, which I think I would never live with them again. And it was
I do remember you
nice
talking
time.
about that.
Yeah, so I had 7 months there in Brazil living with my parents, something that I thought I would never experience again. But there I was. So something good, something bad always has some good about it.
Thank you, Pietro. Biggest takeaway, John.
Workers and people were given agency to put themselves first and say it's okay not to be okay, and think about what I want, and no one's going to judge you on that. And now it's a matter of what are people going to do with that.
And even the fact that we're able to have this conversation couldn't have been as real as that a couple of years ago, I don't think. That's just my opinion. Victoria, biggest takeaway.
I think it's trying to open the box of creativity. I think we talked about being a creative and flexible workplace, and to look at where we are now to where we were 2.5 years ago or pre-pandemic, we weren't flexible. We weren't really thinking outside of the box. And I'm trying to think about how we can keep that going and continue to innovate and try stuff that we think might not work, because it might surprise us.
Okay, your last question, Bruins, and I got to go here. You only can pick one. Best memory from UCLA, John.
My best memory from UCLA, oh my goodness, just graduation and celebrating that with my parents and as a first gen, and never thought I could go to that campus. So the graduation.
Yeah. Victoria.
Dance marathon.
Matt.
Tough, but given how it's changed my life, I'll say all the study abroad experiences.
Pietro.
And the people, because since I'm in New York City, I always get some friends texting me, "Oh, I'm in New York for a day. You want to get a coffee? You want to go to dinner?" And that feels really good.
Well, thank you. And I really want to thank all of you for just being willing to be you this morning, to share your experience with candor and honesty and transparency, because simply that's what Bruins do, right? And one of the things I think I've really valued that hopefully that we can continue is the way that we have been able to come together as a Bruin community over the last, 2 years or so, because our time zones and our geography have not mattered as much. And so may we keep that going. May we continue to do what Bruins do, which is to network with each other, talk with each other, share our experiences, perhaps hire each other, because we are able to do that from wherever we are and wherever we show up. And the fact is that Bruins do show up. So with that, I just really want to thank our panelists. We'll let everybody know when it's up on recording so you can share with your friends. And let's just end with a go Bruins. Thank you.
Thank you. Go Bruins.